In the 20th century, music was transformed by technology, with mass communication birthing new styles of music. At the same time, the role and responsibilities of artists changed drastically. Where artists were previously viewed chiefly as performers, their role expanded into writing, production, and even marketing. In this episode, we explore the evolution of the artist role and the struggle to control their music's destiny. Welcome to the Musicscope. Throughout history, people have looked to musicians for inspiration, entertainment, and a way to give voice to human emotion. In ancient Greece and Rome, music played part in ceremonies, with trumpets announcing government officials, and music a backdrop for religious services. Flutes and the lyra, a stringed instrument, were a key part of reciting poetry, with a chorus added in for performances of comedies and dramas. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, music carried from Hebrew traditions into Christian chants and recitations, with music serving chiefly as a vehicle for worship and praise. Many early Hebrew vocal traditions included an ongoing drone underneath the main vocal line, which was adopted later by Christians. In the 6th century, this was further adapted and developed by Pope Gregory, establishing the Gregorian chant. Music lived mostly in monasteries with very little public performances. This began to change in the medieval period, when performances became common in cathedrals and later in public. Royals commissioned music to be performed in their courts, and thanks to the development of musical notation, music was catalogued and could spread from place to place without the risk of being lost in translation. As music spread, it became more complex. Where chants had typically two main parts, the drone and the melody, music began to emerge with 3 and even 4 distinct voices. Alongside music's development, instruments evolved as well. Brass, wind, and percussion instruments grew in number and variance to accommodate a wider variety of music, although religious vocals were still the centerpiece of songs. Music up until this time had been a very formal affair. It was used for religious services and almost never played at home or without purpose. One development that impacted music's role in everyday life was the arrival of the troubadour. A troubadour was a person who traveled from town to town, telling stories and playing ballads, and would be the first professional touring musician. From their travels, they could cross-pollinate music from different regions, bringing influence from faraway lands in the form of stories and songs. Outside of the royal courts, common people could now enjoy popular songs and ballads at the local tavern. The troubadour's songs, combined with polyphonic composition and a new myriad of instruments, would give rise to the heightened role of musicians in the Renaissance and the concept of simply playing music for pleasure. Music continued to develop, with new instruments and added notation giving composers more tools to create with than ever before. The development of keyboard instruments gave composers an important tool for writing and performing, with the ability to play multiple notes across a wide range at the same time. As music developed, the role of the composer became more distinguished and separate from that of the performer. The wandering troubadour was slowly replaced by 2 distinct classes of musicians, orchestral and folk performers. Orchestral music began as groups of players often commissioned by the court to play for events or simply for the pleasure of the royals. In this setting, music developed and was pushed to innovate, avoiding the threat of potentially boring the king. Soon, composers and musicians competed for positions entertaining the royals, with the most interesting composers winning the appointment and the most job security. As it progressed, music was more and more often performed for the public, becoming more complex and powerful. Development and evolution gave birth to the Baroque, Classical, and Romantic periods, each providing ongoing innovations in composition and performance into the early 20th century. Folk music was typically more regional and relied on traditional song stories that people carried down from generation to generation. Some composers used these influences when writing, giving birth to popular or pop music as it would be known. Pop music began to dominate American sheet music sales in the late 19th century, giving rise to Tin Pan Alley, named after a district in New York where publishing companies hired professional writers to churn out popular songs. The publishers would then engage performers to perform the songs for a fee and drive sheet music sales. U.S. copyright laws were in their infancy in the early 20th century, and the main way publishers made money was through sales of sheet music. Tin Pan Alley kept writers on staff as well as bought songs outright from unknown composers, who engaged publishing firms looking for their big break. The idea of performing your own compositions inspired many performers to try their hand at writing. After all, why negotiate to play someone else's song when you could perform your own and keep the earnings? People like George Gershwin and Duke Ellington performed their own compositions for audiences across the U.S. and Europe. The idea of a performer writing their own material also inspired country and folk musicians like Hank Williams and Woody Guthrie to write music and lyrics of their own, bypassing the Tin Pan Alley practice of charging performers to play songs. Blues musicians such as Robert Johnson often performed in a traditional 12-bar style, borrowing heavily from other artists and adding their own flourishes and words to well-established songs. Often, sections were improvised, or lyrics borrowed from other tunes, creating a set of blues standards that varied between artists and regions. Influence from artists like Ellington as well as Williams, Guthrie, and Johnson would drive people like Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, and later Bob Dylan to write their own songs and perform them themselves and start to blend the performer and writer into one and the same. With the introduction of radio in the 1920s, performers found a wider, more consistent audience. Likewise, recorded media gave listeners the opportunity to hear a performance over and over again. Soon, the performer had stolen the spotlight from the song. As performers gained popularity, artist managers became a key figure in negotiating for rights to an artist's services. Artist representatives negotiated with publishing houses for the rights to songs and with venues for performance fees. Often, the manager took more than their fair share of earnings due to their central role in an artist's career path. When television replaced radio as the primary form of communication, an artist's visual image became much more important and profitable. With his good looks and aggressive style, Elvis Presley drew massive ratings and advertising dollars wherever he went. Young men started wearing their hair in a pompadour to emulate him, and teenage girls screamed when they saw him. Within months, record companies were grooming young artists to emulate Presley, although with a safer, more wholesome image. TV shows like American Bandstand and Top of the Pops in England were important drivers of an artist's public image. Magazines geared towards young girls showcased teenage idols in order to drive record sales. Suddenly, being a musician didn't just mean being able to play and sing songs. It meant being in tune with fashion trends, promoting records on television, knowing how to dance well, and constantly living in the public eye. Management teams were more critical than ever in maintaining an artist's relevance and profitability through their public image. Many musicians starting out had no experience with grooming their image or managing television appearances and were in no position to knowingly negotiate deals with potential managers. This led to many artists being left behind and in debt once their popularity waned. Buddy Holly was one of the first people to break away from his management on the suspicion that he was not earning what he should have. Buddy wrote his own songs, he led his own band, and had begun to produce his own sessions as well. Holly sued his former manager, but would not live to see the results of the suit. This would contribute to future artists taking control of their own material and even managing themselves. In 1958, a young Berry Gordy founded Motown Records in Detroit, Michigan. Gordy helped write and produce the label's first releases, and through its popularity, hired on an unprecedented cast of writers, producers, and artists. Writing teams such as Holland Dozier Holland wrote songs, rehearsed them with the performers, and recorded them all within the same week, sometimes within the same day. The Motown house band, the Funk Brothers, played on more hits than the Beatles, Elvis, and the Beach Boys combined. Motown was a self-contained hit factory that helped lead an entire genre, soul music, with the hits by Marvin Gaye, The Temptations, The Four Tops, The Supremes, Smokey Robinson, and many, many more. Berry Gordy would go on to expand Motown via subsidiary labels such as Tamla and Gordy Records. By the early 70s, Motown had outgrown its Detroit headquarters and relocated to Los Angeles, where it would continue to produce R&B hits. As the first wave of rock and roll transitioned into a safer, more commercial medium, and soul music began to emerge, another movement was brewing. The folk music of the early 60s harkened back to traditional ballads and songs that predated Tin Pan Alley and celebrated the rustic music that originated in rural America. In 1961, a young man from Minnesota moved to where the movement was centered, Greenwich Village in New York City, and began playing in small clubs. The young man changed his name from Robert Zimmerman to Bob Dylan, and inspired by his hero Woody Guthrie, would begin writing songs of his own. Dylan was able to speak to the civil rights and anti-establishment movements through songs like Blowing in the Wind, The Times They Are A-Changin', and A Hard Rain's A-Gonna Fall. By using simple, memorable melodies and poetic language that portrayed its subjects in a very matter-of-fact and self-evident frame, Bob Dylan created memorable songs that spoke to a wide audience in a tone that was serious and artistic, as opposed to the bubblegum pop that was heard on the radio. It marked a shift in the ideas that popular music could convey, and the power that an artist had as an instrument of change. Inspired by writers like Buddy Holly and the independence of Motown and Bob Dylan, the Beatles became one of the 20th century's most important groups. Aside from their musical innovations, the Beatles' John Lennon and Paul McCartney became one of the most popular and prolific songwriting teams in history. The Beatles had found success with their intrepid manager Brian Epstein, who grasped the importance of image and turned the Beatles from leather-clad rock and rollers to nice young men in suits. The Beatles brought image to the forefront with their unique mop-top haircuts, pointed-toe Beatle boots, and like Elvis, they starred in feature films. The Beatles also had a powerful ally and producer George Martin, who was open to experimentation and encouraged the band's creativity. This would help develop the LP as a performance and change the definition of artistic freedom. In 1967, Brian Epstein unexpectedly passed away, and the Beatles forged ahead with managing themselves. In the wake of self-management, they formed their own record label, Apple Records, and produced their own films. The strain of self-management would significantly contribute to the band's demise, but it served as a beacon to major bands such as the Rolling Stones, The Who, and Led Zeppelin, who would also take their destiny into their own hands, creating their own recording studios, labels, and business management practices. The Beatles' self-reliance and Bob Dylan's prolific songwriting inspired a generation of singer-songwriters to share their talents with the world. Simon and Garfunkel, the Beach Boys, the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, and a host of others focused on songwriting as the key vehicle for their songs. Songs were increasingly written and perfected in the studio, then reproduced on stage, when the opposite had been true just a few years before, when a recording was viewed as a document of a live performance. By 1966, psychedelia was beginning to emerge, and layered recordings with self-penned, introspective lyrics dominated the market. Following inspiration from the Beatles' albums Rubber Soul and Revolver, the Beach Boys' Brian Wilson would write, rehearse, and produce the band's classic Pet Sounds album. Gone were the peppy songs about the California shore and the cars and girls you could see there. In its place were descriptions of self-doubt, growing pains, and unrestricted love. Brian Wilson's lyrics were backed by densely orchestrated music performed by Capitol Records' Wrecking Crew, a team of musicians known for churning out #1 hits for nearly a decade. Pet Sounds would in return inspire the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper. By the time Sgt. Pepper was released in the summer of 1967, bands were expected to write their own material and bring unique sounds to their recordings. As record companies latched on, producers would push for artists to be more and more representative of the counterculture, often pushing it to a cartoonish extent. In 1968, in the wake of the breakup of the Yardbirds, guitarist Jimmy Page decided to carry on and reform the band under the name the New Yardbirds. Page had been exposed to the music industry initially as a session musician. Later, he joined the Yardbirds at the insistence of his friend Jeff Beck. Towards the end of the group's run, and after Jeff Beck had left the band unannounced, Peter Grant had been brought in to manage them and hopefully deliver some solidarity. Peter Grant had been a tour manager for acts like Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, and the Everly Brothers. He was also a former professional wrestler and a very physically intimidating presence. When the Yardbirds ended, he and Page understood that the music scene's focus was changing from top 40 hits to albums and live concert performances. They also understood that artistic integrity was a key to moving forward musically. Page would rename the band Led Zeppelin, who would go on to become a primary influence on the way bands conducted business. Led Zeppelin self-funded their first album and then shopped the tapes to labels, finally landing a 5-album deal with Atlantic, giving the band complete artistic control down to the album artwork. This sort of deal was unprecedented, especially for a new band, but it paid off handsomely for Atlantic, both in credibility and in earnings. Grant also focused on concert promotions and infiltrating the U.S. underground market. Aside from setting new payment standards for album and concert appearances, Grant helped set up Led Zeppelin's own publishing company, Superhype, in 1968, as well as their own record label, Swan Song, in 1974. Peter Grant's loyalty and protection of Led Zeppelin's interest helped redefine the role of a rock and roll manager in the 1970s. He took a protective approach to the group and made it a key point to let the band focus on music while he took care of everything else. While Motown, the Beatles, and Led Zeppelin's influence on management have given performers greater artistic freedom, the expectations of stars to deliver commercially have also risen considerably. Behind every star is an army of professionals working to maintain that artist's brand. Signature styles in clothing, shoes, hair, makeup, and even product placement receive as much attention as the music, often delivering greater profits. The potential for music to deliver big profits has not been lost on big business. In the past 50 years, huge conglomerates have purchased multiple record labels and worked to control distribution. Sony Music alone incorporates Sony, Columbia, Epic, RCA, and Arista Records. Sony, along with Universal Music Group and Warner Music Group, account for 84% of the recorded music industry. As these giants promote the artists that can make them the most sales, they also help fund an entire industry supporting huge amounts of touring professionals, marketing firms, and visual artists. Arena performances require truckloads of LED walls, lighting, rigging, loudspeakers, backdrops, cabling, and an army of dancers, audio and lighting technicians, and, oh yes, musicians. Although three big businesses control the majority of recorded output, independent artists are presented with an enormous opportunity via social media. Social media allows the artist to connect directly with fans, with some videos going viral and gaining sometimes thousands of followers overnight. Many independent labels have popped up, often focusing on a specific subgenre or location. TikTok, Instagram, and other social media vehicles deliver music to thousands without the delay it takes for a big corporation to coordinate a marketing campaign. Artists can often make more money per unit through independent publishing, and merchandise profits almost always go directly back to the artist. There are pros and cons to both major and independent labels, but the freedom to choose and publish your creations as you want is light years from where it was 50 years ago. From the 50s through the present day, music has been a revolving cycle of trends. Starting with rock's initial debut, movements are discovered and promoted to achieve success. Hoping to capitalize on its popularity, managers and record labels go after artists in the scene, offering a chance at stardom. Soon, they overfocus and boil music down to only the basic characteristics that started the movement, and it loses its credibility and declines in popularity, only to be replaced by another movement that follows the same life cycle. As technology continues to evolve, artists find new ways to balance industry commercialism with artistic integrity, searching for a path to live off the music they love to create. I appreciate you taking the journey through the twists and turns of the evolution of music's practitioners. Join me next week when we discuss the evolution of the music industry, technology, and what the future may hold. Thanks for listening to the Musicscope. I'm Mike Grubb.